You are listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE and INTERZONE Digital. You can find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and more about INTERZONE Digital at interzone.digital. Talking to me today is Elizabeth Bear, author of numerous science fiction and fantasy novels, short stories, and lots of other things as well. Thank you very much for coming and talking to me, Elizabeth Bear.
I am delighted to be here.
I wanted to. You've just been in the INTERZONE Stories social, saying some really fascinating things about short stories, and I wanted to kind of start off just by kind of asking you to tell people a little bit about, maybe how you got into writing and also how you got into writing short stories versus writing novels, sort of the story behind that, because they're obviously very different creatures and you do kind of occupy both those spaces, incredibly strongly.
Oh, well, thank you very much. When I was very small, at some point I realized that that moment that children have where they realize that food comes from someplace before it is in the supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
Like it comes from a farm. I kind of had that experience with books. Like books, I realized that somebody made books. And as soon as I realized that, and I must have been 6 or 7 years old, I knew that what I wanted to do was make books. I also wanted to be an astrophysicist and a jockey, but 1 out of 3 ain't bad. And I do have a horse, so I guess it's kind of 1.5.
I was going to say you do have a horse, and you write about space.
Yeah, it's nearly the same. I just don't have to do the math, and I don't have to jump. Do steeplechasing at 35 miles an hour.
Astrophysics without the hard parts, yeah.
Yeah, I let other people do the hard part, and then I borrow their work. So initially, when I was very little, I sort of indiscriminately wrote. I guess you could generously call them short stories and poetry. And I spent a lot of my early adolescent years writing a sort of fat plot coupon fantasy of the sort where the endlessly increasing band of adventurers wanders from place to place around the planet, collecting bits of things that they will eventually need to solve the problem at the end.
Uh-huh. Did you call it a plot coupon fantasy?
A plot coupon fantasy, yes. You have to go from point A to point B and collect all the plot coupons, and then when you get them, and then at the end you can redeem them for a climax.
Okay, here's your stuffed bear, sorry dragon. Right. Okay.
Yes, exactly. It's like a scavenger hunt. You have to go and you have to find, the magic sword and I don't know, the magic ring and the wizard and the princess who's got the other thing, and and then somehow get them all into the same place at the same time. And it's like a logic problem. It's like the thing with the fox and the goose and the cabbage,
Okay.
And so basically it was just years and years of work, and I actually didn't finish what I would call a real novel until I was 30. I kept getting the first third written and then getting stuck because I didn't know how to do transitions. And I think this is a problem that a lot of apprentice writers have. Like the first third is the easy part because that's the setup. It's when you have to write the middle that everything becomes terrible.
Right. You have to kind of get past that. Is it, the hump or?
Yes. Yeah. The 30K wall, as I like to call it.
Okay.
30,000 word wall.
And then the first finished, like the first published novel would have been which one?
Hammered. which was the
Hammered. I
fourth.
was going to say, yeah,
Yes.
Hammered is the first, right?
Yep. And that was the fourth novel I finished, and probably like the 23rd that I started.
Oh, were my eyes deceiving me, or has Hammered recently had a new audio or the first audio reading? Because I was looking around for titles and it looked like Hammered had a new cover.
Yeah, the Jenny books, I really like those covers. They're very I don't know, sort of diesel punk. Um, the everything sort of big and machiny, and but yes, no, the Audible versions just came out either earlier this year or late last year. I don't remember which. Um, and I'm super excited to have them. They're from Trantor Media, and the books were published almost 20 years ago now. It'll be
Mm,
20 years in 2025,
wow,
which is hard to believe. I've been doing this for 2 decades now. Uh,
that's a lot of words.
yeah, it's a lot of words. But I'm delighted to have them as audiobooks. I haven't actually listened to them yet, because I get incredibly self-conscious about listening to my own work in audiobook.
Oh, okay. You can't go through the whole thing.
I it depends. Like sometimes I can, and sometimes if I'm about to start another work in a series, I will listen to the audiobook of the previous work because it gives me a little more distance.
Uh huh.
But it's also it's incredibly embarrassing. Just
Right. To
I
go
don't know
back.
why. Yeah, exactly.
I
And
had the
you're
same thing with when after spending kind of hours upon hours on Interzone 294, I had the same thing where once it was actually physically in the building, so to speak, I couldn't open it.
yeah.
It was quite hard to actually initially sort of want to go through it, and yes, I am probably the person who's read it the least,
Yeah.
hopefully, or well, probably not the least, but one of the least.
Also, by the time a book gets to publication, I've been over it so many times that I can't remember what happens in it because there's so many different versions in my head. So again, when in writing a series, I have to go back and check and see what actually wound up in the book as opposed to on the cutting room floor, or got changed, or uh, but also it's just by the time it's in print, I've probably read it 20 times and I'm just sick of
No, no more.
it. Page proofs. Oh, page proofs are the worst torture ever because you can't really change anything at that point.
Hmm.
Um, you're just reading for corrections, and yet everything is terrible because you've read it 20 times, and it all seems like it's like watching cartoons with your kids.
Uh-huh.
How many Teletubbies reruns can you sit through? Or
How many Totoros? Yeah, how many Totoros? Or how many? Yeah, yeah.
oh
I mean,
yeah,
the one answer is like there is never too many. The other answer is yeah, there is. There are points.
I would much rather sit through a Totoro than a Teletubbies marathon. I'm just
Teletubbies. Yeah. Also, things look different when they're set, right? So when you get those page proofs back versus whatever font you used in your manuscript versus sort of seeing it on the page. At least for me, I kind of notice things differently. I
yeah,
happens the same with the website. So you have to do it because you do see things. It's like a great proofreading tip to like change the font, read backwards, all those kind of things you
yeah.
hear, right?
Print it out, change the font.
Yeah, change the font, but it still starts to get too much. It's like no. Where in that kind of novel writing process did the short story writing process begin, or so when in that process did it begin?
So they were always sort of interlinked. Um, I was finishing short stories earlier than I was finishing novels. Like I was still very much like feeling my way through them. I didn't have a good sense of structure yet. Um, One of the hardest things for me to learn to do was tell a story in a linear fashion. And I mean that even like on a sentence level, because I have a very strong tendency to try to do 17,000 things at once. So part of my drafting process is taking my incredibly long, convoluted, and somewhat repetitive sentences and breaking them up into something with a through line and an arc, as opposed to like a series of overlapping spirals. um, because I do really tend to sort of, when drafting, when I'm figuring stuff out, I tend to go back over the same territory more than once, and so I have to go through and remove a lot of that or tidy it up. The Weirdly enough, despite that tendency, I am, generally speaking, a terrible underwriter. And Stephen King's thing about a second draft is a first draft minus 15%. My second draft is my first draft plus 15%, because I have to go in and explain everything.
Oh, okay.
Because I never like, and by explain everything, I mean like character motivations, like that, and transitions. That's the thing that never makes it into the first draft for me. Um,
And that's true for short stories and for novels.
yes,
That kind of that underwriting and then adding.
yeah, and also the tendency to repeat myself.
But I mean, in the story Social, we were talking about Dolly, and it's interesting you talk about underwriting or overwriting, because one of the things I said was that it did feel like it was exactly the right length for what it was doing, and there are these lovely details. Looking at it, I'd read it before more for the story, and reading it now for sort of reading it again for the story, but also reading it for the details. And there are sort of the lovely little bit where she's picking at the hangnail, and you add that detail that the crime scene gloves dry out her skin. And it's one of those little kind of teeny tiny excellent sort of little observations that just sort of puts you right back into that, this is a crime story, right? But it's also a story about, this woman who's nervous about, or not nervous, but who's sort of, is, going through her day with all of these sort of, very normal, very sort of human anxieties. It's, so it's,
Yeah.
I wonder kind of, does that kind of thing, is that kind of second draft, third draft thing?
It's sometimes it's first draft. Sometimes those little character bits just show up and they're part of the flow, and the part of the fictional dream. Uh, and sometimes you think of them later and are like, oh yeah, this would be exactly the right thing to put in here. The other thing is that you have to sort of take out the things that aren't the right thing for that character. Um, for example, like that particular character, if I had had her picking at her cuticle, and mentioned, that the her manicure had left her, cuticle, like that's not a character who's going to have a perfect manicure. So I would have to fix that if I had just sort of thrown that in there for a bit of business. And sometimes you notice immediately that you wrote the wrong thing, and sometimes you have to go in and fix it on the second or third draft.
And you used that great phrase earlier in the Social. You said how you're kind of like with characters, it's almost like a sort of method approach where you the character is right or is doing the things that feel right. And I suppose, if you're writing a story over kind of weeks or months, your view of who the character is changes. So you have to kind of go back and fix things too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes I often joke that some of the most interesting characters are the ones that take forever to let me in, because the they can be interesting because they are hiding a lot of stuff. And part of my job as the writer, I am I don't want to get all woo on you, and I'm fully aware that these are all like little fragmented particles of my psyche that I have invented, and am using my peculiar human neurology that allows us to model the behavior of, like allows us to develop theory of mind and model the behavior of other creatures.
Mm-hmm.
That so it's when I say that, when I refer to a character that I'm writing as them, that othering process is part of making them distinct and making not every character be just me in a funny hat.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, every so often, I do write a character who is just me in a funny hat, which is very enjoyable and very easy because, I just have them do whatever I would do in that situation.
Okay.
But I would be a terrible protagonist because I'm far too cautious.
Uh-huh.
I would be like, that's a giant monster. And nope, nope, nope.
Mary Sue wouldn't work here. Yeah.
I will be in the basement. Yes. Yes, I will be in the tornado shelter. Oh, look, Godzilla, I'm leaving.
That's the end of the. That's a really short. That's a flash.
Just very short story.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned like othering with characters, and something else I was thinking about looking at this one, and I went from Dolly. I reread Dolly, and then I reread. Oh, no, I read for the first time. A blessing. Is it A Blessing of Unicorns? I've written the
Oh, yes.
A Blessing of Unicorns.
Blessing of Unicorns.
Which wasn't deliberate. I wasn't looking for like two sort of cop stories, and I just had that was the issue I had. And I realized, I haven't seen that. I don't think I've looked at that one. So I went there, and that was an audio first. That was Audible Originals first. So I took a look at that in Asimov's, and I was thinking right from the beginning how it's not just that the characters are different, it's also that sort of stylistically the prose is different. The prose in those feels, or the one I've read. So I haven't read In the House of Ariaman yet, but the prose seemed a lot more. Yeah, just like a different vibe to it. Hard to kind of put my finger on. A bit more jocular, kind of a bit more sort of. There was a kind of a different kind of. There was a lightness to it, and the world as well was sort of obviously a very different setting. And I wonder, is that something that you're very conscious of as well? Not just othering the characters, but also othering your style. So I'm writing in this style. I'm writing in that style for different stories.
Yeah, I do try to find a voice for any given story and any given character. And um I feel like and it's interesting because you're right that both of those stories do feature sort of middle-aged single female detectives.
Mm-hmm.
But they're very different people. One is very lonely, and very isolated and alienated, and has basically nothing but her work, and is in much more of sort of a noir setting. And the other one, the protagonist of um, the Bangalore stories, is very connected to her family. Like her family drives her crazy constantly, and it's sort of a running gag throughout those stories. Um, she loves them very much, and they also drive her out of her gourd. And 50% of the conflict in the stories comes not from solving the mystery, but from navigating her relationship with, her mother and her aunts.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. I love the ability to take a person who is in some way, take a category of marginalization, shall we say. So in
Mm-hmm.
this case, like female law enforcement officer, um, and show a bunch of different people who do not conform to stereotype. Um, because I feel that one of the ways that we force the world to see us as people is to present in a variety of different fashions,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, definitely.
and because the sort of characteristic Western narrative for so many years is, four guys who are all different and a chick. And the chick's personality is that she's the chick.
Female as a character trait, you mean?
Exactly, exactly. And I'm saying chick ironically there. I feel like I should point that out. But it's the Smurfette thing, right?
Right.
27 Smurfs and Smurfette. And Smurfette's personality is that she has eyelashes and blonde hair and a dress. Um, Whereas when you have a selection of different women, even if they're in different stories, they all get to be people.
Yeah.
They don't all have to carry all the weight of being the female character. And I feel like that's super important, honestly.
Yeah, and that's a huge thread running through lots of the books of yours that I've enjoyed, is these very very sort of individual females characters, and kind of you mentioned how, if Godzilla walked in, you'd sort of turn the other way, which is but these are female characters who are kind of like faced with challenges in their world. I mean, it sounds really obvious, right? Because it's a story, but they're faced with challenges, right, and dealing with them in really human ways, and coming to life, in very different ways. So that, I think it's really interesting to hear you say that about
yeah. And it's really fun to write characters who are very different, because if in that hypothetical Godzilla scenario, I think pretty much every female character I've written would deal with it differently. I think all the male characters would deal with it differently too, but like Karen Memory would run right out and get in a mech suit and go fight it.
Steampunk mech suit or something.
Yes, yep, exactly. She'd find one.
Yeah.
I have faith in her. Whereas I've certainly written other characters who would be like, okay, we need to come up with some sort of bitter lemon for giant reptiles that will steer it in the wrong direction. You're out there with your little squirt bottle of dog repellent, and
no, that's really really interesting. And also with the I need to kind of I plan to actually kind of take a look at those two. Is Farron and Indra Pramit, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Those I want to kind of look at those sort of to get like back to back, because I'm really intrigued to see this, because I know you're really a fan of kind of like detective novels, right? The time I interviewed you before, I think you were talking about kind of like rereading sort of classic detective novels, sometimes to see what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And I suppose it's logical that you'd have a series, right? You'd have this sort of these recurring characters who are kind of investigating, but in those stories the attraction isn't the crime. Like if I'm looking at Bosch or reading Bosch, I the crime it's certainly intriguing, but I'm super interested in Bosch, right? Mm-hmm. I want to know about the detective and his family and the way he sort of he holds his cigarettes or whatever it is. It's that kind of close study that really draws me into those. Is that also what kind of draws you into like writing and reading that kind of story?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it also, the detective's character has to inform the way the investigation happens.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at and I'm going to pick a low-hanging fruit here, the Agatha Christie,
mm-hmm.
the difference between the Hercule Poirot novels and the Miss Marple novels, and the way that they approach investigation,
Mm-hmm.
is delightful to me, because it is a character study. It's a set of character studies. You've got Poirot's obsessive compulsiveness, you've got his meticulousness, you've got his arrogance, whereas Miss Marple is operating on a deep baked in knowledge of how human beings operate, and like a, a much more sort of intuitive structure. And I think what's really cool about Christie is that she was able to create two absolutely iconic characters who are so different and who approach their narratives in such a different way. That's a very unusual thing. Like
Yeah.
most authors get one if they get one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it quite that way, that she did sort of create these two completely different, and gave herself two completely different, ways of essentially, solving crimes, right? So,
Yeah.
talk about being prolific, but also there's a point where if you have the same detective solving crimes, how many times can you have Poirot do certain things, but you also give yourself more narrative choices as well. So that's I hadn't thought of it quite that way. Very smart writer.
Notoriously smart writer.
The did you see the tweet or the social media thing about the 100 people locked inside the Agatha Christie museum, I think it was, and the power went out?
I saw it. I was actually at ReaderCon when it happened, so I didn't follow up. But I did in fact see that. Yes, the delicious irony of that particular little news item it's very satisfying when the universe gives you those little gifts, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of like if you were trying to convince me that there were ghosts, that would be one of the things you should put out. Definitely satisfying. So are there more of those Ferren Indra Pramit sort of stories on planned, or are you thinking of more?
I may have come up with an appropriately gruesome way to dispose of a body, which is always the that's the most important factor in those stories, is the
okay.
I shouldn't say that's the most important. That's sort of the hook. It's the shtick.
Your Google search history must be really dodgy.
If I can't start with a horrific crime scene, what's the point? Oh wait. I'm actually just reading Tade Thompson's Far from the Light of Heaven. Speaking of horrific crime scenes, the space station or spaceship garbage disposal stuffed full of disassembled corpses. I don't think I'm not going to be quite that gross, but
which book is that? What's the title again?
It's called Far from the Light of Heaven by Tade Thompson.
That sounds cool. There was S.A. Cosby. I think it has written these great kind of crime novels, and I think his tweet was something like about asking someone about how much DNA would be left if I was disposing of a body in a wood chipper, or he was replying to someone about this, or like conversations writers have about crimes. It's
lots apparently. Apparently, getting the DNA off a wood chipper is really difficult.
Yeah, you've checked. It's gonna get everywhere, right? It's gonna be absolutely everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah. So the backstory there is that the infamous wood chipper murder actually took place only a couple dozen miles from my childhood home. So,
oh no,
that was local news when I was a kid.
Oh dear. Oh, that's wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Moving from crime to AI. You obviously Dolly in Tetler, there's this kind of whole question about kind of robots and consciousness. Although reading it this time, I actually had a different take on it, but I'll go back to that in a second. But you've also written these sort of big space operas. about that involve AI, and there's a third one on the way next year, right?
Yes, I've handed in the first draft. So it's the third white space novel. It's called The Folded Sky, and curiously enough, it's also a mystery in space. Um, the I don't I don't know. It's such early days. I don't really have an elevator pitch for it yet.
Oh, so,
The protagonist, yeah, the I've just handed in the first draft, and my editor has it and is occasionally sending me nice notes, but hasn't sent me a revision package yet. Um,
for INTERZONE kind of listen of INTERZONE podcast listeners, maybe kind of the other two,
sure,
because it's machine and ancestral night.
Ancestral Night, yes, yeah, no, the first one is called Ancestral Night, and it's about a salvage operator with a mysterious past who stumbles across a uh, horrific crime scene and is sort of sucked into a galaxy wide plot um, that involves ancient alien civilizations and dark secrets and things that she has chosen to forget about her own childhood and young adulthood. The second one is Machine, which is about a uh, trauma and rescue surgeon who is part of the group that discovers an ancient and apparently derelict generation ship,
Mm-hmm.
and goes into it to attempt to help the people who may or may not still be inside. Uh, and then there are some shenanigans. Um, she was a lot of fun to write because she's like many talented surgeons, a little brittle and difficult. Um, and trying to make her approachable as a protagonist was extremely challenging. But competence helps, and at least she's competent. The third one involves an archinformist, which is my coinage for people who do complicated historical data retrieval on ancient systems,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
who is one of a couple of people on a research team um, attempting to rescue a Matryoshka brain from a star that is on the verge of going an ancient and uh, enigmatic Matryoshka brain from the orbit of a star that is on the verge of going supernova.
Wow.
Um, and of course, her long term rival and enemy is also on the research team. And then her wife and kids show up.
Oh, oh no.
She's having a bad day at work. Bad day at work.
Oh, that sounds great. No, that sounds. Thank you for that one. So that's that the first draft in next year, but the other two are I think the other two are both out in paperback, right?
The other two are both out in paperback. Yes.
Okay, so definitely check those two out. I was looking around because thinking about short stories, and I think they just how kind of important they are, or how much I enjoy them. I just like reading short stories, but also how much for writers who are starting out in particular, that they really the short story magazines do give a kind of a place where people can get published, which is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still writing novels and short stories, and I think I saw, is it Twin Strangers in an anthology that's your most recent published short story?
I believe it is. Yes, it just came out in the Tasting Light from MIT Press, which is a young adult futurism
Oh, it's MIT.
collection of original stories. Yeah. Yes. And that's That's about a kid who gets in trouble with some algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Kid who gets in trouble with some algorithms. That's almost like the perfect segue. Okay. So tasting light, 10 science fiction stories to rewire your perceptions. And that's, so your Twin Strangers is in that. That looks great. I'm going to have to, and you've done some other things for MIT Press, right? You wrote, was it one introduction or more than one for those Stanisław Lem volumes they were putting out?
I wrote one introduction for I wrote an introduction for one of the Stanislaw Lem collections.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very happy with it, because they did let me be somewhat critical.
Yeah.
Both in the pointing out some of the things that haven't aged well, but also in just doing some literary analysis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which I love to do, and I don't often get an opportunity to do. And I've also written a couple of short, novellas, for the 12 Tomorrows series. The most recent of which was a story called OK Glory, which is about a tech bro who gets locked in his own smart house by terrorists or extortionists, not terrorists.
That's
another bad day at work.
Another bad day at work. Well, there are threads running through the stories. I mean,
yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. I mean, I guess he's like a proto tech bro. Wow. Okay. He in Dolly, it's I guess in a sense, there's maybe you could imagine that character being a tech bro. I think even in it. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to say, yeah, I think that's a fair.
Yeah. Because I think there's a line about how these are perfect for narcissists, right? And so, of course, the kind of the stereotype tech bro narcissism is great. Yeah, this is a great target for all these stories.
There's also a lot of I find the move fast and break things ethos very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on so many levels, because when you say break things, what you really mean is break people.
Right.
And if you're not considering the ethical implications of what you're doing, then you're just contributing to this sort of new Gilded Age that we all find ourselves trapped in and looking for a way out of.
Yeah.
And well, there's your dose of socialism for the podcast. What? The socialism word? Slight digression to socialism. Apparently, Star Trek actually used the word socialism for the very first time. Chris Farnell asked on Twitter about it, or was double checking and saying, like, was that mentioned, the first actual mention of the word? And it seems like, yeah, Strange New Worlds has achieved a first there. They actually directly mentioned socialism. They actually said something about a socialist utopia. That's true. They did.
Yeah.
I've actually been enjoying Strange New Worlds a lot more than most of the other recent Star Trek. It feels like a return to form to me. And sometimes it's
good fun.
Yeah, and I don't go to Star Trek to be depressed.
No.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
That's what The Expanse is for.
I saw Enterprise for the first time recently, and I was really surprised. Not surprised, but I'd heard sort of, really mixed things about it, and I'd never actually sat down and properly watched it. And I was really surprised just by how much joy there was, not just in the interactions, but also just in the setting, and how, putting these people, in these spaceships with low ceilings and, squeaky floors and all of that kind of, doors that don't open automatically. There was a real sort of pleasure in seeing them go through that process, installing phasers on the fly. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the great joys about Star Trek, is that it's just, you don't want to see loads and loads of dark, grim things.
Yeah, I'm not. I watched the first season of Picard, and I'm like, I don't want body horror in my Star Trek.
Hmm.
Like, so having Strange New Worlds to come back to is really, I've been enjoying the heck out of it. Even when it's extremely silly, and it is sometimes extremely silly, but it's got heart.
Yeah.
And I feel like there was this long chunk of like the late 90s through the early 20 teens, early to mid 20 teens, when everything just had to be grim as heck.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know if it's a reaction against the real world seeming grim as heck for the past, 8 years or so,
Hmm.
but
I don't know. Yeah.
it's 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 an improvement.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder how much with some of these space shows where they get darker, whether there's actually there's like a technical element, right? Because when you're filming a show like that, you need a lot of light to light the sets, to light things. Cameras need light, and I wonder if
Yeah.
as the tech has kind of improved, people just sort of there was a creep towards let's lower the lighting because it looks more kind of inverted commas moody, and then the stories sort of come in. Yeah, it gets moodier too. Because I noticed that I think there were moments in Picard where I was like, after watching The Next Generation, you kind of go, yeah, it's just like everything's lit differently.
Yeah, what happened to all the bright colors?
Yeah, yeah,
Um another thing is that I think culturally we are sort of programmed to treat dark or grim material as more serious and more
yeah.
worthy than pleasurable material. Not even pleasurable, because some dark stuff can be extremely pleasurable. Like, uh, I'm not going to say that Macbeth isn't a hell of a lot of fun, uh, um, but also there can be a great deal of serious artistic merit in something that is not um, not grim.
Yeah.
My friend Catherine Addison, aka Sarah Monette, she writes under two names,
Hmm.
has established a distinction a long time ago, probably 20 years ago at this point, where she was talking about noir as a setting versus clair as a setting. Um,
Hmm.
and this actually takes us back to the uh, Dolly versus the Farron stories,
Hmm.
because Dolly is noir and the Farron stories are clair. Like, terrible things happen, and you know, but there's a sense of uh, good-heartedness, and that the future may not be devastatingly dark, that I worked very hard to bake into those. Um, and I feel like that is a much more useful distinction than whatever it is that uh, what whatever marketing term it is that people are throwing around this week.
That's a really, yeah, and I think that's a great sort of, the marketing terms normally center around genres, and the genres tend to be centered around themes or tropes, whereas yeah, tonally
Yeah,
that's a great distinction because it cuts across genres, right? That distinction.
right. Because people talk about, she, as Sarah Monette, she wrote the Melusine and the Doctrine of that whole Doctrine of Labyrinths books, which are incredibly noir.
Hmm.
They're extremely dark. And as Catherine Addison, she's, writing The Goblin Emperor and stories in that world, which horrible things happen. Like, the people talk about The Goblin Emperor as this fluffy, happy book. Um, but it opens with the main character being savagely beaten and orphaned.
Hmm.
Uh, like, That's but the thing is that he spends the entire book trying to be decent, and I think that is the distinction there. That you have that. What was Raymond Chandler's thing about the knight in tarnished armor?
Oh.
As the noir protagonist, and your Claire protagonist might be a knight in tarnished armor, but they're trying consciously to get better. And I think that the success of some like television shows like The Good Place and Ted Lasso spring to mind immediately. These are not shows that are shallow
No.
and that are afraid to talk about big topics. Or I've just started watching The Bear,
Oh,
which is
okay.
I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I haven't seen it yet. I've heard really good things
It's
about it.
I had been avoiding it because I thought it was going to be extremely dark. Um, and often I find the shows that really double down on darkness to not have enough other stuff going on. But it's incredibly big-hearted.
Okay.
And not in a twee or cloying sort of way. And I just find, I mean, human decency is so hard. It is so hard. It is so much easier to be an asshole. And watching, consuming media about people trying to be decent and having that be part of the conflict is very satisfying to me.
Yeah, no, it's harder to. I don't know if it's hard. I wouldn't know if it's harder to write or not, but I feel like it's there's more there's a subtlety required for that, and it has to be it has to be. You can make it's like your Bond villains. You don't need a huge amount of character building to make your Bond villains villainous, but you do need to. Bond needs the work, right? If you're going to go along with him.
Yeah, and
not that Bond is trying to make himself better, though.
No, Bond is Bond, and is doing Bond things, and
So I think the Picard is interesting because I think they kind of got. I think in terms of going from the Picard of the kind of lighter, more. TNG wasn't always light, but it was about that optimism, and then taking that character and then doing what they wanted to do. I think or what they were trying to do in season 1 was a real that's going to always be hard. I think it wasn't. I wasn't sold on it. I wasn't sold on most of Picard until probably. And then this goes back to something you said in the story social about how we become attached to objects. And there was one moment in season 3 where the Voyager theme came on, and then another moment where the Enterprise D came out, and those two moments were real, like, oh, they've shown Voyager, and like Enterprise D, and it's really silly, right? But at the same time, that's kind of what Star Trek really for me is about. So when that came back a bit more strongly in season 3, I was watching it a lot more closely.
Yeah, I think about while we're on Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan, and like what is and the search for Spock, that pair of movies. Like, what's worse, Spock dying or the Enterprise being destroyed? Like, it's hard to pick, and the Enterprise is just a chunk of metal.
Right.
But you get really attached.
Yeah.
You get really attached to objects, and it's probably adaptive on some level in a scarcity society. If you lose your axe, you're in big trouble.
You hold on to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Linking back to the short story, talking about becoming attached to objects. There's in Dolly. There's a great kind of description of how the when she goes home and her her kind of robot is cooking, how he's not wearing a shirt and his back looks like it's starting to fade. I kind of in the way Bakelite might or plastic might,
Yeah.
and it's been fixed. And when you were talking earlier about kind of how we treat objects, and just then when you mentioned that, I was thinking that's a great little bit of character work there, because she hasn't replaced it as it's got older, either because she couldn't or because she didn't want to, but she has, either had it fixed or taken care of it. And yeah, we do hold on to these, like, whether it's a battered axe or a battered iPod or whatever it is. It's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I live in a, by American standards, very old house. And it's quirky and creaky and has a lot of weird little things that are annoying about it. But I love it for its history, and I find its history very comforting. There was a period during early on in the Trump administration, which was an emotionally rough time for me for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
When I reminded myself that this house has been here not not just for close to 300 years, but through multiple domestic wars, through foreign wars, through other plagues, through, and having that sense of continuity and solidity was actually incredibly comforting to me. When I felt like nothing was reliable.
That's interesting.
And I mean, it's just a house, it's an object, but it's an object that I have an emotional investment in.
That you've kind of even though it's not human, it's seen things and it's survived, and we take something from that.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of like the Sphinx with its nose knocked off,
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end. I think that's a nice optimistic place. We want a little bit of optimism, a bit of socialist utopianism, maybe, or
a little, just as a treat.
Yeah, this is a treat, because there's enough things going on. My wife said something yesterday about, like, sort of what we were talking about, all the things in the news, and it's like it seems to be floods, fires. Are there frogs falling from the sky yet? No, not sure. It does seem to be at the moment. We're living through a particularly grim time for lots of reasons.
The bad floods in my region of the U.S. I know people who have lost their houses or been trapped up hills, and it's been quite a thing. We're fine. Well, I haven't gone down to look in the I haven't gone down to look in the basement.
Oh no.
But, I'm going to check in a couple of days, I think.
After thinking about something optimistic, I've managed to digress. But there was a really cool Netflix show a while back about a big flood that happened here in Poland, in Wrocław. And one of the early scenes, the scientist goes into a basement, and she sort of touches the walls, and the walls are kind of weeping. There's sort of, there's a load more water in the kind of water table than there should be. So even though everything looks fine, it's sort of, there's like this sort of early warning sign that there's too much water.
Yeah.
Do you get like early warning signs? Do you kind of know that, okay, if this is happening, start preparing?
Yeah. Our house has the basement. The foundation of our house is not watertight. It's just what we call here field stone. So it's stacked raw stone, but it's not mortared in any way. So water does come in and flow out again, which is we have a very variable water table here, and that's one of the techniques for dealing with it. And all of the physical plant of the house is up on risers so that the heater and so forth are safe. But it does mean that our basement isn't useful as anything other than basically a hole in the ground. You can't store stuff down there.
Okay.
but it also means that I have the privilege of not having to worry too much about it if there's water in the basement. Like the sump pump will take care of it eventually.
Okay.
um,
It's just, it's supposed to do that.
it's supposed to do that, yeah. Um, and the only problem is if it starts to like come up the stairs, but that hasn't happened. So
Okay. Oh, goodness
and
me.
hopefully won't.
Okay. Well, that's great. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Fingers crossed for not floating away mid podcast.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and for coming on the Story Social as well. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I always enjoy it. Yeah, thank you very, very much.
It's been delightful. Thank you.
This is INTERZONE Pod. I am Gareth Jelley, and today my guest was Elizabeth Bear. Subscribe to INTERZONE at interzone.press and read stories for free at interzone.digital. Thanks for listening. See you next time.